Thank you very much for showing up for the last two lectures in the new year. This is going to be the second. It's going to be will be my last lecture, and the second last lecture of our course. The last lecture will be given next Monday by Clay Reed on controlling the brain with light on optogenetics. Unfortunately, I will not be there because I'll be spending the entire next week with the Dalai Lama in India, giving him a very long version of this talk that I will be giving to you today on attention and on consciousness, since they're very interested in finding out about Western notions of consciousness. And I thought I'll give a talk about that too afterwards. So today I'll talk about attention and consciousness. I'm purposefully not going to talk a lot about the brain because I wanted to present you with the phenomenology of attention and of consciousness, with the brute facts of attention and consciousness. We all experience them, and you'll see it's mainly, the data is primarily from human, a little bit from monkey data. But given the context here of MindScope, we should really be thinking about how can these ideas be tested in mice. And in principle, if you can do it in a monkey, there's no principal reason why you shouldn't be able to do it in a mouse or, in fact, any other type of animals. And we've talked with a number of people about doing some certain types of experiments, psychophysical experiments in mice. So the three fundamental questions I'll try to just outline today, not to give you final definite answers. A, what is selective attention? B, what is consciousness? What do people mean by consciousness? In some sense, it's a pre-Copernican term, meaning many different things to many different people. And what is the relationship between selective attention and consciousness, particular sensory consciousness? That's been the subject of a lot of research over the last 10 years in cognitive neuroscience. So there are very different usage of the words attention. Psychologists primarily differentiate between two forms of attention. One is selective attention, and I'm primarily going to, or only today, will be talking about visual attention and also visual consciousness, because they have been the best studied by far in all of psychology. We're very visual animals. 20 to 25% of our visual cortex is given over to visual perception, and for us, vision is the most important sense, and we understand it best of all the sensory modalities. So I'm just going to talk about visual attention and visual consciousness, but in principle, people have applied some of the same concepts to auditory attention, for instance, or somatosensory attention. So people distinguish between pay attention to me now, what you would say to a teacher, or and selective attention. So I was confronted by this fact. This is me doing the Tyrolean Traverse. It's a spectacular way to get from point A to point B. This is Lost Arrow Spire. It's a climb in Yosemite Valley. You can see it from here. You can see it's way up there. And what you do, and you see how this relates to attention, you start up here, you climb down into the notch, then you climb up here. It's a very difficult climb on the outside. You're almost a kilometer of the ground here, and then you traverse back over there. Now, during this point, when you do this, you are highly, highly aroused. Your brain is on fire, as it were. You're hyper aroused, and but that's not the mechanism that psychologists talk about when they talk about sensory attention. We talk independent of the level of arousal. We talk the very selective processing of attention, that I preferentially process things here but not here, or that I listen to at a cocktail party. I'm trying to listen to the conversation I'm having. I'm trying to tune out all the other sounds. So that's a different sense of attention as this attention you have here when you do something like this. It's very arousing. In fact, this is a beautiful quote. This relates to the first form of attention. One of my favorite quotes from the writer Krakauer, who's written, some of you may know him, he's written a famous book called Into Thin Air. And here he describes this former type of attention that's much more closely related to arousal. When you really, in this case, you're in the zone, when you climb for hours in this very alert, hyper-alert state. But even in this alert state, you still choose to pay attention to certain features of your environment, and you still neglect most aspects of your environment that are irrelevant to the task at hand, including your own self-consciousness, which is why climbing is so addictive, because that inner voice, that inner critic is totally shut up when you're climbing. So we're talking about selective sensory attention, and this is a very famous quote from William James, the father of one of the fathers of the foundational figures of psychology, certainly in this country. written more than 100 years ago. He says, everyone knows what attention is. It is the taking possession by the mind in clear and vivid form of one out of what seems several simultaneously possible objects or trains of thought. It implies withdrawal from some things in order to deal effectively with others. So it's very important. So when you attend to something, it comes at a cost. You're choosing, voluntary, involuntary, not to attend to most things in your environment, which can have comical or catastrophic consequences. I'll show you the former in some movies. So what is the function of selective attention? I think that attention is really something we can see we're beginning to understand quite well. So if we just look at monkeys and humans, there are roughly 1 million fibers leaving the eye. In a mouse, it's closer to 40,000. That carry on the order of a megabyte of raw information per second. It's actually not raw because it's already compressed from the 5 million cones or the 100 million rods in your eyes. It's already compressed down to 1 megabyte of information per second, which by current internet standard is of course very little. But it's still much, much more than our brain can handle in real time. Furthermore, there's all the other competing demands of all my other senses. There are the 40,000 optic axons coming out of my inner ear. There's my entire somatosensory representation. There are internal body states about hunger and pain. There are my internal distractors. And at any given point in time, I can really only attend to one or to a very small number of things out there in the world or inside my head. And so I have to choose what to attend to. This is true of any organism, even if you're a supercomputer, particularly in a competitive situation where you have to act very fast. You cannot process everything at once, and you have to you have to do a triage and sort of neglect certain things. And so evolution developed a variety of selection strategies just in the visual domain. We'll be talking a little bit more about them. But the bottom line is that some aspect of your input, in this case the visual input, is selected for processing by higher level cognitive routines. So in particular, if you want high-level cognitive access to high-level cognitive routines, you have to attend. That's what all the experiments show. You have to attend to things. If you don't attend to things, your brain can still process them to a certain amount, particularly if you're familiar with the stimuli, but it can do more complex processing. And the consequence is that the non-attended portions of the input may not be are either processed at a reduced bandwidth or may not be processed at all. So you may totally fail to miss. You may miss to observe certain things. Now, attention is common to all animals. Has been studied. Some nice work done in fruit fly, in the housefly, in fish, in rodents a little bit, but not a lot. In particular, in monkeys. It's been studied quite well in monkeys and in people, of course. Now, people typically distinguish at least two forms at the top level. They distinguish two forms of attention, and there's different names: endogenous, exogenous, bottom-up. I call them bottom-up versus top-down attention. So, bottom-up attention is attention that's specified in the environment. When I talk loud, my voice will automatically, independent of the task that you may be currently attending to, will draw your attention. When you dress, for example, in this way, where you have contrasts, pink, blue, or pink on this sort of more neutral gray, that'll attract your attention. And what attracts your attention, that's called saliency. People refer to this as visual saliency or auditory saliency. And that's done in a fairly automatic way. People talk about task independent. Independent of the task that you're currently performing, certain things will draw your attention. Exit signs, for instance. They're designed that way that they automatically draw our attention by having these bright green or traffic signs. They have red color. They're meant to draw our attention independently of the task we're performing. And so in terms of visual domain, the bottom-up form of attention exists throughout our visual field, at least in primates. It acts at all times. It's sort of fairly automatic, seems to be built in the retina, LGN, or early stages of visual cortex. Is transient, though, typically. So typically these things will transiently grab your attention. I, for example, have difficulty in American sports bars. I don't like going to sports bars because the TV is on, and independent of the conversation I'm having, I find my eye always drawn to the television picture. I always get distracted, even though I may not want that. It doesn't seem to depend on task, and is only on a limited volitional control. Then there is the much more powerful form of attention that you can choose to deploy, and you should try it. You can do it independent of your gaze. So you can fixate your finger, and then you can shift your attention around. You can look out of the corner of your eyes, as it were, right? And you may do that, for example, in a socially embarrassing situation, or when you do martial art, when you look there, but you're actually attending out of the corner of your eyes at your opponent. And you can perfectly well do that, and you can shift your processing focus around, independent of your eye gaze from here, for example, to there. And you can show, if you do that, there are real behavioral advantages that accrue to that. That's not just something you imagine, but you can show if you attend over here, you can do certain things quicker here. You have a faster reaction time and lower error rate than over here. People have done lots of experiments and to show that. So the top-down sort of is certain under volitional control, and you can attend to things for a long time. Although it comes at a cost. It's called vigilance. So radar operator have to do this. Lots of people who have to watch. If you're hunting or things like that, when you're watching for an event that's very rare and you're attending there, and you can do it, but it comes it's not easy. This is another mountain. Like this is somewhat similar to the famous picture of René Magritte, C'est nu pas un pipe. Because there's a double entendre in here, a double visual entendre. You all know this chocolate, right? It's a Swiss chocolate. Now this mountain here on the Toblerone is actually this mountain. It's a Matterhorn in the Swiss Alps. Okay, it's a classical, beautiful climb here. And I was taking a picture of it. Now, we're automatically drawn to the hand. Our gaze is automatically drawn to the Toblerone, and it's automatically drawn to the peak here. Whatever quality in the image that draws your eye automatically is called visual saliency. Okay? And now, visual saliency has been exceedingly well studied. There are a couple of 10,000 papers on this alone. And most of these papers use this idea that I advanced a long time ago when I was a postdoc at MIT. The idea is the way saliency is computed in your visual system or in the visual system of a certain number of computer vision system is you have a map, a topographic map of the environment that encodes how interesting things are in terms of saliency. Now, how do you define saliency? Saliency is simply defined as how different is one location from the locations around it. So if everything is green, but there's a single red object there, that'll be very salient. If everything is oriented this way, but there's something that's oriented the opposite, orthogonal to it, that'll be very salient. And you can generalize this. And so the idea is you have all these maps in your brain, some map for color, for orientation, for faces. We know experimentally, whenever you show an image with a face, the first thing, bam, the very first saccade that people will execute, even if you tell them don't look at the face, or if you ask them to look for something, you tell them ahead of time it's not on the face, people will still look at the face. So faces will automatically draw our attention, for obvious biological reason. So the idea is that you have all these different feature maps for faces, for color, for orientation, and they all feed their information into the saliency map, and then the brain just visits first the most salient location, and then the next most salient location, and then the next most salient location, and you read out the information there. And we know something where these saliency maps are located. They're good candidates for such a map in the monkey, and there were two recent studies in human fMRI in various parts of the brain called lateral interparietal cortex or frontal eye field. These are different parts of cortex, or also certain subcortical structure like the superior colliculus have been implicated in visual saliency. And you can download a program. It's been done a couple of 10,000 times now, where you can do this also automatically, where you give an image and then you process it at a different spatial scale. This was done by my then graduate student, who's now a professor at USC. You take an image like this, you process it at a different spatial scale, and in color, intensity, orientations, faces. It's gotten very fancy now. It's gone commercial, and the software will tell you what's the most interesting location, what's the next most salient interesting location, etc. That's of course also of economic interest for people who like to control your eyeballs. The advertising industry, they would really like to control your eyeballs, right? Where you look at a web page, in a billboard, they like to control every time you open an ad in a newspaper. All these people want to control your eyeball. They want to attract your attention, and so they're interested in these sorts of things. So here, for example, this software predicts that first you go here, then you go here, then there, then there. Now you can do tests to compare that, etc. So that's bottom-up attention. Now the top-down attention, that's the much more powerful one. It's very flexible, it's task-dependent. So depending on the exact task, you can choose to attend, to letters or to airplane silhouettes if you're a pilot trying to do a very rapid visual friend-foe discrimination. You can program your brain to, particularly with training, to attend to almost any feature. It can last indefinitely, as I mentioned. It takes some effort. There are three forms of top-down attention that people distinguish in primates. We don't know to what extent they all exist in rodents. One is spatially based top-down attention, and there the metaphor people use is a spotlight of attention. So I fixate here and then I choose to attend. It's like a spotlight. I shine a spotlight in my internal mind on this area over here, over here, over here. And the spotlight can have variable scale. You can choose to attend to a very, if you need to look for something very small, or you can choose to just sort of to zone out because you're just looking for motion. Here you are, you're looking down at a forest or something. You're just trying to see does anything move. You can train yourself to zone out, go to a very large spatial scale, and just be attracted to any sort of motion. You can attend to features. So you can choose to attend. When I dropped off my kids at daycare, it approximates a random walk with ants. You have 40 kids running around every which way randomly. And your daughter wears a blue dress today, and so you can just choose to attend to blue. And then blue things will tend to be more salient. And we know quite a bit about the neuronal and the hemodynamic basis of that. And you can also attend to objects. So you can attend to an entire object, an entire figure or entire letter, and which means you get a preferential processing of all the features associated with that object. And we know, this is particularly true for primates, it's less likely to be true in rodents, which move their eyes much less. There's a very close relationship at the neuronal level between those mechanisms that control my eye gaze and those mechanisms that control my selective attention. In fact, some people call it overt and covert attention. Overt attention is where I actually move my eyes. Now remember, we need to move our eyes much more than mice because we have this, you saw it in earlier lectures by Clay, we have this very high acuity central processing resources where most of our cone photoreceptors are, and then they very rapidly fall off. So in order, for example, to read or to engage, to look at the face expression to see are you looking at me or are you asleep or are you smiling or not, I need to move my eye gaze to your face. Rodents, they have a much, they don't have this steep fall off. In fact, they have fewer photoreceptors at the center of their vision than elsewhere, so they do that much less. But then we also have this covert form of attentional shift that you can shift in your mind's eye. And we know the neural structures relating to those two seem to overlap to a significant extent. So these are cortical regions I talked about, another cortical region in visual cortex, the fourth visual area, superior colliculus, and pulvinar, part of the thalamus. It completely, we know almost nothing about this in mice or rats. And you can override, of course, top-down attention can perfectly well override bottom-up saliency-driven attention. So this is the guy who uses a phone. How many people notice something? One? Single person? Left hand. The left hand? Two? Right, let's look at this again. Okay, the person sits at their desk and then the phone rings and he answers the phone. Different clothes? Let's look at this again. Do you really think it's the same person? It's a different guy. And then they call us experts. I mean, look at, so it's a different person. Now, this is called discontinuity errors. And maybe after the lecture you go to a website called movieerrors.com or something, or moviebloopers.com, and they give you for all your favorite movies errors when A, they're discontinuity errors. For example, a typical error, I mean, this is made for the movie, this is made for psychology class demonstration, but very often you have because they do the filming, outside filming, you know, different days than inside filming, so people will be dressed differently, or outside it's pouring rain, so the actor's jacket is dry, the interior scene is filmed the next day, it will be wet, and you're completely oblivious to this. So one of my favorite films is the Lord of the Rings trilogy. I mean, it's amazing, it's shocking how, if you go to the website and look at the Lord of the Rings, how many mistakes there are, where it's just obvious bloopers. But the point is they're not obvious, they're only obvious once somebody draws your attention. Why? Because we don't attend to, for example, here we didn't attend to the face, and we know it's a white guy with glasses on, and that's all we do. So that we quickly identify him, and we assume, of course, it's the same person, because, you know, it makes sense. He hears the phone and goes to the phone and answers the phone. It's got to be the same person. And you'll be quite shocked when you see how many errors are there, even in movies that cost $100 million to produce, where you have specific people. So they designate a specific person who's just supposed to be, you know, doing the scripting and the filming, supposed to be on alert for these sorts of errors. Now this is same thing happening to people. So she's being an unwitting volunteer in a subject in an experiment she doesn't yet know about. Now see what happens. I know, here, look at her. She looks directly at the guy. She looked at him before. She's totally oblivious to this, okay? Here's another case. Again, he looks at him, and this older gentleman, and he tries to explain. He claims he's lost and he needs some direction. Again, look at him, directly at his face. All right, so these are also, so this particular scenario is called change blindness. That we're blind to, and there are lots of, I mean, there are hundreds of experiments and cute movies you can look at. We are blind to changes in the world. There's a particular nice one, for example, if you're ever in San Francisco at the Exploratorium, where they show you a picture of a street in San Francisco, typical, you know, very steep street, a street in San Francisco with houses and cars, and it flickers. And you look at it, and things flicker, but it seems like the same. And you look at it for a minute or two, and you see, okay, and then you walk away. And then somewhere you see, I mean, what's the point of this? And then they show you the first image in this sequence and the last image, and they're completely different. It's a different street with different cars, with different houses. And what they do, each time it flickers, they change one, you know, a red car changes into a blue car. Or over here, you know, it flickers and a door will disappear. And over here, suddenly, you know, a chimney will be added. And so the first scene, the last scene are completely different, yet you don't realize it because, you know, it's still the gist. The gist is still the same. It's still a, you know, steep street in San Francisco with cars on it. So all this shows that that we can be oblivious to many, many things in the environment. In fact, it's claimed that up to a third of all accidents happen, these car accidents. Now, this is particularly the case if you're on the cell phone, or it's really bad if you're texting. So if you're on a cell phone, people estimate that the loss of attention is equivalent to the loss of attentional resources when you're legally drunk at 0.08% blood serum. Why? It's not the mechanics, so whether it's hand off or hand off doesn't really make any difference to it. It's the fact that you're really engaged in your conversation, and the person at the other end can regulate his or her conversation as a function of what's happening in the traffic. So if you're talking to somebody, you know, in the car, then of course if there's a dangerous situation, lots of traffic, you will both slow down, but the other person of course doesn't know this. And the endless amount of experiment that shows with texting becomes a factor of 4 words. So texting is probably as bad as driving drunk. Now, of course, magicians exploit this all the time. Magicians are superb at using attention. They really know about attention, attentional capture. Last week's New Yorker has a wonderful story of a friend of mine, Apollo Robbins, who's a professional pickpocket. I spent 2 days with him in New York City. And he started off pickpocketing me, and you're again totally oblivious to it. And the way he does it, he really manipulates your attention. He touches you over here, for instance. You draw your somatosensory attention on the right hand, and then he quickly sneaks off your watch on your left hand and things like that. So magicians, they didn't use fancy, interferometry or robots or any of that stuff. They just use, they have hundreds of years of intuition in where people attend to and what happens to the places that you don't attend to. All right. Now let's switch to consciousness. So consciousness, so I said where you can turn off the light. So consciousness is much more difficult. It's a subject that's been around roughly since the time of the ancient Greek. In Western thought, it's really been René Descartes, who's sort of the father of modern Western thought on like he's the father also, or one of the fathers of science in the scientific method of Western thought on the mind-body problem. Now, in order to bring it down to a level that's amenable to scientific study, something that we could do, you can just operationalize it. And the form of attention, so just amuse me, keep me happy by either fixating here or fixating here. It depends where you sit. I can't really predict it. So just keep your eyes steady, either at this course or this course. Keep your eyes as steady as you can. Same thing here. Either at this course or this course. Just at one of them. Keep your eyes very steady. And then tell me what you see. All right. So what you should be seeing, otherwise you should see me afterwards. What you should be seeing is the yellow. So you should all be seeing a cloud of blue swirling dots, right? But in addition, you should be seeing yellow squares. Now, sometimes, if you can really keep your eyes steady, one or sometimes even both yellow squares will disappear. Do you see that? Yeah. Okay, it's a motion capture. It's a cute illusion. Now, notice actually that the blue dots never obscure the yellow square. So they're purposely excluded. So it's not that the yellow becomes occluded by the blue square. The yellow, in principle, is always visible. It's always there. Yet sometimes, for reasons we don't really understand, our brain makes us see them, and sometimes we don't. And the difference that I've been interested in now since 25 years, the first 15 years with Francis Crick, the difference I'd like to understand, where's the difference in your brain because when you see the yellow squares and when you do not see the yellow square. And this is a perfectly valid operational definition of visual consciousness, okay, not other forms of consciousness. So, I mean, consciousness ultimately is about experiencing the world. Whether it's through visual experience like the yellow, and sometimes the yellow isn't there, although the photons will still strike your retina, and they'll still excite at least some neurons in your primary visual cortex, yet somehow in the catacombs of the brain, under some condition, those neurons don't give rise to consciousness, while other conditions, they do give rise to consciousness. Now, and the claim that Francis Crick and I always had, once we understand this simple form of visual consciousness, we probably understand at once all the other forms of consciousness. It's probably going to be like DNA. Once you understand DNA in some animal species, like the cow where it was first studied, you'll probably understand it turned out to be very similar in all other species, whether it's humans or giant sequoia trees. And the claim is that all the different forms of consciousness, hearing things, I actually hear voices in my head, and so do you. I see something. I'm not just doing motor behavior. I actually see a picture in the world. And it's not at all clear how this picture comes into my head. I smell things. And I'm, of course, also self-conscious. I know certain things about me. I know what I had this morning for breakfast. I know I'm a man. I know I'm going to die one day. These are certain types of experiences. They relate to myself. But that's just self-consciousness, just one aspect of a much larger form of consciousness that we experience all the time. You experience from the moment you wake up, right? When you first wake up and you're just dimly aware of the bed and the dark room, or the dark, if you wake up here in Seattle right now, to the point you go to sleep. You always experience something. Now, what you experience changes, dramatically throughout the day. It can be pleasure. If you make love, it can be pain. If you have a toothache, it can be color, it can be sound, but you always experience something. And what Western science and philosophy first has been trying to grapple with is what is the relationship between what you experience and and the underlying physical system, the brain. In fact, it goes even deeper, because the first question is, how is it that the physical system, like my brain, right? My brain is a physical system like any other object in the universe. It's particularly complex, but it's still a physical system, obeys all the laws of physics, yet somehow this brain can generate feelings. Right? And most people think that the iPhone right now doesn't generate feeling, but it's also a physical object. So we have to ask, where's the difference? Is it because it's alive, or is it because it's evolved, or because it has neurons, whatever those things are? All right, so consciousness, so the way philosophers talk about it is consciousness is equated, it feels like something to see yellow, and it feels different to see red, and feels different to see motion, and feels different to hear mom's voice, and it feels different to have a toothache. Those are all different experiences, and they all feel different. They all feel unique in their own way. Consciousness is subjective. So by its nature, it's subjective. I can never, it's a dilemma that songwriters and people in love and people who try to ferret out spies always try to find out what is the other truly feeling. And we have ways of inferring that from their behavior, from the way she blushes, etc. But ultimately, we don't really know what the person is feeling. So it's subjective and it's immediate. I don't have to infer that I have pain. I immediately know that I'm in pain. In fact, consciousness is the central brute fact of our life. And it always struck me as shocking, particularly when I started this 25 years or 20 years ago to think about this professionally as a scientist, how science could exclude the study of consciousness. The most central fact of my life and the most central fact of your life is that you're conscious. The only way you know about anything, the only way you know that you're alive is because you feel a body, you feel yourself, right? Without consciousness, I wouldn't know anything. I couldn't do science because I wouldn't see, I wouldn't hear. And so, in fact, this is the most famous deduction in Western thought is really René Descartes, who said it very well 350 years ago. First in Latin, cogito ergo sum, then later on in French, je pense donc je suis, translated, I think, therefore I am. If you read him in modern language, he would say, I'm aware of something, therefore I am. I might be mistaken about who I am. I might be mistaken that I think, the opposite gender finds me incredibly attractive, but I'm not. But one thing that's undoubtedly true, it's a central fact of my existence. I know I exist. And there'll be a time, unfortunately, when I don't have this feeling anymore, namely when I'm dead. And so that's the central challenge that we're facing with the mind-body problem, to explain where this something comes from and which sort of systems can have this feeling. So adult, healthy brains can have it. Now it gets already more difficult when I look at certain types of patients that might be, for example, locked in, or that might be in a bad traffic accident. That already gets more difficult. What about a baby? What about a fetus? What about a dog? What about a mouse? What about a worm? And then what about other systems like iPhones and the internet? Another way of referring about this is look at the difference between a virus, a black hole, and a hydrogen atom. Now what all those three systems have, and the brain, what all those four systems have, they have what philosophers refer to as a third-person account. You can measure them, you can poke them, you can make theories of them, you can measure the effect they have on the environment around them. They have a third-person account. But only the brain, as far as we know, electrons and protons and black holes and viruses, we think don't have them. The brain, this is a healthy brain, this is my brain, having a visual experience. Only the brain also has its first-person account. It feels like something to be the brain. Now we know the first-person account and the third-person account are closely linked, because if this brain gets a sufficiently strong hit on its head, it's going to not experience anything. It's going to be unconscious. We know that if this brain, for example, lacks, so this is, I drew in by Photoshop, this is the area that people think is active when you're seeing color. So if I lose this, like some patients do, they become colorblind. They become so-called cortical colorblind, achromatopsia, which we talked about. They're unable to see the world in color. They still see the world, but they see the world more like through a black and white television. So we know this part of the brain, okay, the first-person account of color that only I as experienced subject can experience, relates to the third-person account of having behaviors that are indicative that I have color behavior. But we'd like to understand much more. We'd like to understand the level of individual neurons. Are certain types of neurons necessary for this? Is it the type of activity they engage in, whether they oscillate or synchrony, or do they have to have a loop to the front part of the brain, or do they have to sit in a particular type of layer, or does quantum mechanics needs to get involved, as certain types of, or in general exotic physics needs to get involved to explain this, as some people have hypothesized. But we like to understand how is it that these pieces of excitable matter can give rise to feelings. In particular, and I'll come back to this point at the end, that most of this time, most of the activity in our body is not perceived at all. So I have no idea. I drank, like some of you maybe, over New Year's Eve, right? And my liver was busy doing, what livers do with the alcohol dehydrogenase, yet I had no conscious awareness of it, right? So my liver, certainly we know, has very complicated functions. My kidney has very complicated functions. My immune system, they all have very complicated functions, yet they seem to do that without any consciousness. In fact, even most brain states we now know are not associated with consciousness. There can be furious activity in different parts of my brain without me being aware of it. So it seems only a particular type of brain activity, or maybe in particular privileged areas, give rise to conscious sensation. Now, we have to distinguish here between two usages of the word consciousness: content of consciousness and states of consciousness. So when I talk about the yellow square, or when you make love, or when you have toothache, those are all different. It's consciousness, but it's filled with different content. And we believe that the content provider is really the cortical thalamic system. But then there are also different states of consciousness. So the three common ones we experience every day, in fact with some regularity, is awake, you're all awake, is deep sleep, non-REM sleep, when you get very slow waves, and REM sleep. When you're conscious, your consciousness changes, right? Your sleep consciousness is not the same as your wake consciousness. For example, you have very little introspection. You're not surprised that you can fly through walls or meet people who are long dead, or you can do incredible deeds in your dream. But you're certainly conscious. So those are three different states of consciousness. And then there are pathological ones. The extreme one is the closest cousin to death is coma. In an extreme condition, your brain will shut down, and to most people you looked at, although you're still alive, now typically either you die or you recover within a week or two, unless it's medical-induced coma, like the last prime minister of Israel, who's still in a medical-induced coma. But typically you transition either into death or quote, into different state. So the next one is the vegetative state. So the vegetative state, people have, it's defined, they have a circadian rhythm, they have sleep-wake cycle where they have their eyes open. In fact, they move their eyes, very disconcerting, and they might groan or move a boat. Or occasionally they do something like this. If this persists for more than half a year or a year, depending on the condition, you call it persistent vegetative state, PVS. And then you can wake up out of that. The next condition is called minimal conscious state, where the patient has some awareness at least some of the time, to full consciousness. Now you might remember this lady, some of you will remember, Terri Schiavo. She was in the national news under President Bush 12 years ago, 14 years ago. She's actually only one out of an estimated 20,000 patients like this that are alive in the US alone. So she's a PBS patient. She was in PBS for 14 years. Her heart stood still, and then she was rescued. The heart stood still for 20 minutes, so it caused permanent damage, anoxia to her cortex. In fact, that's her cortex at postmortem. Had shrunk to half the size. There were 4 separate medical examinations by different people, and it was uncontroversial. She was in PVS state, so she moved. What's very tragic that occasionally, her eyes will track something once in a while. And if your mom, and of course, so famously the parents sued to stop the then husband, because he claimed she wanted to die. She did not want to be in this state so according to the best of our scientific knowledge, it doesn't feel like anything anymore in this state. Terri Schiavo died 14 years earlier. But her body was alive and her brainstem mechanism was alive. The EEG was flat. But so there wasn't anything called Terri Schiavo anymore. She died 14 years earlier. And the husband wanted permission from the courts to remove her life support, and the parents thought that it's a terrible tragedy. Because if you look there and sit as a mother day in, day out, and then occasionally you'll see that she quickly tries to track something, then of course you think your daughter's still in there and alive, yet this never repeats. So it's essentially brainstem reflexes. It's a pragmatic problem also, because you'd like more precise tools that people are developing now to actually tell you, is this person unconscious, or is there some at least limited form of a conscious there? Let's say some form of anguish, is that present or not? So it's important to distinguish between content and states of consciousness. Now, what else do we know about consciousness? So as I said already, consciousness is associated with certain types of complex adaptive system, not all. So I mentioned already the immune system. It's very complicated. Well, you have several immune systems, but the learned one has memory, yet you're not conscious. I mean, for all I know, I might be getting infected. I might have caught a bug yesterday, but my immune system is fighting it off. I have no conscious awareness. Why? We don't know. There are roughly 100 million neurons in your gut called the enteric nervous system, right? It has opiates, it has neurons, it has synapses. It doesn't seem to give rise to conscious sensation. What does give rise to conscious sensation through the vagus and other nerves is part of the insula that represents these internal body system, but it doesn't seem to be, the conscious doesn't seem to happen here. Why? We don't know. Conscience does not require behavior. We know this, because as I mentioned, when you go to sleep and you wake up inside your sleeping body, you dream. And to prevent your body from acting out your dreams, right, you can run or fight or engage in other sort of behavior in your dream. To prevent your body from doing that, your body actually paralyzes you, right? There's a central atonia, and we know about the brain mechanisms of that. So we know that you can be conscious without behavior. We also know it from patients who are cataleptic, or for example from the frozen addicts at Stanford who were taking a tainted form of heroin that knocked out part of their substantia nigra. They're completely catatonic, unable to move, yet fully conscious. So we know at least once you have consciousness, like an adult, you don't need to behave in order to be conscious. We know that you don't require emotions. We know this from, again, clinical cases. For example, some of the kids that come back from Iraq, the veterans, and for example, this one I'm thinking of, he was in an improvised mine, improvised explosive device. The device took his legs, so his life, he survived, but he took his legs off, and he had brain damage. So his life was now irrevocably changed, right? He was, for the rest of his life, he's confined to a wheelchair. If you talk to him, no affect whatsoever. It's just just has a flat voice. You can hear there's no emotion, a totally flat voice. He's clearly conscious. He can tell you how he feels, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of emotions, particularly certainly strong emotions, because the neural substrate of those were lost in the trauma. We know consciousness doesn't require language, nor does it require self-consciousness. We know this from, again, from patients. We also know this from children who can't talk yet. We also know this, and people have done an fMRI experiment. If you really are engaged with the world, like, for example, when I was climbing there, when I was doing this Tyrolean Traverse, when you're watching an engaging, exciting movie, when you're speeding at high speed on your bike through the traffic here in Seattle, and you have to be hyper aware of everything, your conscience is out there, because you can't afford really to be terrible self-conscious and self-reflective. Because if you reflect too much, you're going to be dead, right? Because there are all these other things out there that move, and they have very hard surfaces, and you can't afford to collide with them. We also know this gives rise to shift in neural activity in different parts of our brain that involved in processing external stimuli or internal one. So the claim is that self-consciousness is a particular type of consciousness that's sort of hypertrophied in us. Some of us, particularly intellectual, can be incredible self-conscious, although it may not necessarily lead to a more happier life. But that's just a specialization that we have. Many times in our life, we're not all that self-conscious, and most animals don't, or only have very limited forms of self-consciousness, as ascertained, for example, by the self-mirror test. We know consciousness doesn't require long-term memory. Again, we know that from lots of patients who've lost their long-term memory. You talk to them, you walk out of the room, you come back, they have no idea, they've just talked to you for the nth time. So we know it doesn't require long-term memory. And we know from experiments done at Caltech by Roger Sperry and his colleagues that consciousness can occur in one cerebral hemisphere, typically the left one, but even the right one, which typically doesn't talk, can sing and can do very complicated tasks. In fact, it may well be true that in certain types of split brain experiments, you have two consciousness inside a single brain skull. And there's some evidence to indicate that there are two conscious beings with slightly different memories that are all logged in the same brain case inside the same body. And most important for a localist account is that we know, as I mentioned before, there's this very close relationship between particular parts of the brain, particularly between parts of the cortical thalamic system and particular type of content. So as I mentioned before, if you lose even a very small part, like less than a grain of rice, we know in one beautiful case, a case study by Jack Galland, this particular patient is unable to see color in his upper left quadrant. He can still see color here, here, and here, but he doesn't see color here. We know from other patients, if you lose it, you can be face blind, unable to see faces as faces. You can have specific losses in other sensory modalities. You can feel that your spouse has been exchanged by an alien because you lost the feeling of familiarity in Capgras syndrome. So we know through 150 years of clinic, there's this very intimate relationship between particular types of content of consciousness and particular part of the cortical thalamic system. So it seems to be, as I mentioned before, that the cortical thalamic system provides the content for our consciousness. Now here you see two gorgeous conscious creatures, both girls. One is my daughter, and the other one is her beloved Tosca dog, the German Shepherd, gorgeous creature. And certainly she and I fully believe, and I think most people, or certainly anybody who's ever been around dogs, most people would agree that a dog is also conscious. Now the dog is not self-conscious. The dog doesn't sit there and say, my tail wags in a funny way, should I do something with that? Right? Or the dog doesn't think about next week, or the dog probably doesn't think too much about last week. The dog is more like a true Buddha. The dog is really in the here and now. Now, a little bit objectively, why do we think that mammals in general, including mice of course, why do we think that they probably have consciousness, or very likely? Now note, of course, that the problem of consciousness is I'm not even fully sure that you guys have consciousness, right? That's the usual dilemma. It's called solipsism. In principle, all I have access to my own consciousness. Now most people assume that you guys are also conscious. Why? Well, because your behavior is almost, statistically speaking, is very similar to mine. I get you, I can dig you, I can understand sort of more or less why you guys do what you do. If I put you in a brain scanner, your brain will be basically the same as mine. We're all very closely related. And so it would be extraordinary if I would be the only one in the universe who had this gift of consciousness, but you not. So I think it's a reasonable proposition that we all conscious. Now, how far does this go, this analogy? So certainly dogs have similar behavior, not identical. They don't talk to you directly like we do, but neither do babies. But just like a baby, if you are around dogs, they have so many different ways to communicate their state, whether they're sad or happy or curious or rambunctious. Right? They have their bark, they have their ears, they have their tail. They have all sorts of ways to indicate their emotion, just like people or other animals do. So our behavior is similar. If I run with my dog's in pain because we run too much. Well, I give her aspirin and the same drug seems to work. Her limping symptoms go away. The similarity of brain architecture, this is the first thing I learned here when I came to the Allen Institute as an advisor many years ago. It's just the remarkable similarity between brains. If you take a little grain of rice, of human brain, of dog brain, of mouse brain, of monkey brain, it all looks the same. We know there are differences, but the differences are really in the details, really down in the details, right? Overall, it's all very, very similar. The big difference is size. So a mouse brain is 1 gram, roughly, half a gram, 1 gram. A dog brain is 50 gram. A human brain is 1,400 grams. A blue whale brain is 5,000 grams. Okay, so the main difference is size. But by and large, at least mammalian brains have the same neuron, same structure, same receptor, even the same gene, right? We know it now, but overall, if you step back and just look at the overall distribution of genes, there isn't anything that immediately say, wow, this is radically different in human than it is in mice. We're all nature children. And of course, we're all closely related. So if you just argue based on behavior and based on the similarity of the underlying hardware, again, it would be totally amazing and would be completely uncalled for only us humans, Homo sapiens sapiens, to have consciousness, but not all these other guys, right? Because then you have to postulate, well, there's something special about us, but we haven't found what's special. Of course, many people on the planet, historically, even today in our country, believe that what is special is a soul, right? That only God has given us a soul. In the faith I grew up in Roman Catholic doctrine, only God has imbued human with souls, and animals, although they're gorgeous and they should be protected as part of God's creation, they don't really have souls. In fact, so René Descartes also defended this point of view. So he's of course the father of modern dualism, and he postulated there are two sorts of substances. There's res extans, things that have extension, like brains and bodies and stuff in general, and there's res cogitans, thinking stuff, but only we have thinking stuff. Animals don't have the thinking stuff. But of course there's no evidence. The concept of a soul by itself is intellectually a scientific concept. It's sterile. because where's the soul, what's this carrier, what's the link between my brain and the soul, how does it exchange energy, how does my soul make me do anything? People have asked forever these problems, and none of them have any satisfactory answers. Where was my soul before I died? It's a gigantic reservoir of soul somewhere, and God just plucks out a soul and puts it into new fetus. And where am I going to go once my brain dissolved? So that's why we don't think there's a soul. And then really there isn't really any good reason to reject that any of these guys don't have consciousness. Different consciousness. These guys will have much more redolent in odors, right? It's going to be much more olfactory one. And as I said, probably doesn't have much self-consciousness. So our main specialization seems to be self-conscious and everything that entails and language. Now, while most people are okay with that argument when it comes to dogs and cats, it gets a little bit more problematic with these guys, for instance, or any other non-mammal. So I love bees. Bees have, they're beautiful creatures. They make our honey, responsible, of course, for the flowering plants. They co-evolve together. This is their brain. These are the visual lobes. These are the most complex structures in any nervous system. These are called the mushroom bodies. And the circuit density is roughly 10 times higher than the circuit density, let's say, in cerebral cortex that we're so proud of. They contain on the order of 800,000 neurons, have highly complicated nonlinear feedback, and have very complicated behaviors. Right? So they can do dancing, they can recognize individual faces, they have this very complicated, sophisticated ways to find a new nest, all sorts of complicated behaviors. I really have not seen any good reason to reject the hypothesis that even this little guy, well, they're all girls, almost all girls, that she also has some ceiling, that if she smells the golden nectar and gets the golden nectar, when she hums, that she also has maybe some simple feeling of happiness. We don't know. Right now, we don't have a good behavioral way to test for that in some of these creatures, although people are doing it in squid and octopus. But I find a priori no reason to reject it. And I think as scientists, people will typically say, "Oh, come on, Christoph, it's just a bug." Well, yeah, but it's a bug, so it means it's very different from me. It doesn't have my size, and it doesn't look like a mammal. But that by itself can't be a good enough reason why it may or may not be conscious. We have to come up with better reasons. All right. Now, the most popular way to approach consciousness over the last 20 years has been something that I had the privilege of helping to bring about together with Francis Crick, of course, which is, let's forget about, so traditionally consciousness has been attacked by philosophers. That's because philosophy was the only tool we had to think about it before the emergence of really modern science or modern or clinical science in the mid-19th century. Only then people really begin to ask more scientific, empirical, accessible questions. And much of the philosophy of mind, of course, has remained barren just because of our inability to introspect. Just thinking around and, well, how do I think? The fact is, evolution has not given us access to most part of the brain that generate our mind. We only have access to very limited parts of the brain, as we all know. And so most of it is hidden, and just speculating about it by smart people just isn't good enough. So let's forget about that and focus on something that we can do today, and that's to focus on the neural correlates of consciousness. So the idea is you have a particular percept, you have a brain here, sees a particular things, see this dog. Okay, so the person now is conscious of the dog. That's the content of his consciousness. And then there's going to be some neural mechanism. Okay, he is firing of some pyramid cells, the oscillator, whatever your favorite mechanism is, and let's study that. And ask, where are these neurons? Are they of a particular type? What happens if this person has another visual experience or has an auditory experience? Are there different neurons in different brain areas? Is there something common about them? What happens in patients? So there's a burgeoning industry now of people who do these sorts of things. So for instance, this is the little brain. This is the cerebellum. Okay? And ironically, of course, more than 2/3 of nerve cells in our brain are in this little brain. 69 out of the roughly 86 billion neurons are in the cerebellum. And if you lose that, for example, in adulthood, due to stroke or a gunshot or virus, although that's rare, I guess, what you get is ataxia, slurred speech, and unsteady gait. So you're not going to be a rock climber or a dancer anymore. But these patients, they never complain about loss of consciousness. They don't complain that suddenly the world has lost color or hue, or that they can't experience pain or pleasure anymore. So whatever is taken away here, which relates to fine, acquisition of sensory motor data, doesn't seem to be consciousness. So now the cerebellum is not an NCC. This raises the question: what is it about the cerebellum, although there are all these beautiful neurons and Purkinje cell, and they have beautiful spikes and all of that, complex spikes. Why does this not give rise to consciousness? Yet activity in this system does. The retina. So the retina, as painters have emphasized since several hundred years, is not where we see. We don't see with the eye, we see with the brain. And there are lots of evidence to indicate that. For once, the character of retinal ganglion cell firing is very different from the character of my perception. Lots of things indicate that. For instance, I have a hole. We all know I have a visual hole. We talked about it before. It's called a blind spot, yet I don't see that. So if I'm conscious of my retinal activity, I should see a hole. Yet I don't have a hole because my brain interpolates. Now then we come to the visual cortex. So this is 20% of the brain in human that's given over primarily only to visual cortex. There are other areas that also involve vision, but also other modalities. And in particular, of course, we can ask about primary visual cortex here. We had it many. And this is a question that people spend a lot of time, many papers came out in Neon and Nature and Science and other publications. Does or does not consciousness reside in primary visual cortex? And so you can ask, do you need primary visual cortex for conscious vision? In other words, are there patients that if you remove V1, they can still see? Is it necessary and sufficient? In other words, if you only had your V1, can you still see? Or is feedback into V1 necessary? People have done and I'm not going to talk about it. These are just questions people raise now. So it turns out the bottom line is that V1 is neither necessary nor sufficient, but often co-varies with conscious vision. So in other words, very often you can have lots of activity in your primary visual cortex, lots of neuron spiking or fMRI activity that you're not conscious of. Okay, so now what about attention and consciousness? Well, scholars typically in the general public in general assume that they're really the one and the same, that you attend what you're conscious to and you become conscious of what you attend to. I hope I said it the right way. And then when we withdraw attention from an object, that then it fades from consciousness. And many people today, although less over the last 10 years, really advocate that there's a very either identity or very closely linked attention and consciousness. And it's important because you want to know, are you looking at the neural correlates of attention or the neural correlates of consciousness? If they're different, then I have to distinguish them. So my claim has been, and there's now lots of evidence for this, that attention and consciousness are different things with different functions. In one case, we know exactly what the function is for attention. For consciousness, we don't know what the function is. And yes, true, typically in a laboratory condition, the animal or the person will become conscious of what the subject attends to. But there are lots of, I'll show you one, there are lots of experiments now in the literature where you can attend to things that you don't see. In other words, you can attend to things that are unconscious. And this is more controversial. In fact, there was just a big exchange in Trends in Cognitive Science between a bunch of Harvard people and ourselves about, can you also become conscious of things without attending to it? That remains more open. So this is a common technique that people use in the field, was pioneered by my student now to here. So what it is, in the left eye, you see this biologically very powerful, very charged image, an angry person. Low contrast, stationary in your left eye with a mirror or something. In your right eye, you see these ever-changing, they're called Mondrian, after the Dutch painter Pierre Mondrian, these changing color flashes. Now what you'll see here for a minute or two is only this. If you keep on staring at it, then the face will eventually come through for 5 or 10 seconds, then will disappear again, then again for a minute or two you see only this. Okay, it's called continuous flash suppression. Now as soon as you blink with your right eye or close your right eye, you immediately see this. So what happens is that attention is drawn, because this is stationary low contrast, your low level attention is drawn to this stimulus, and you won't see this, although it's present for a minute or two on your eye. So in principle, you can use these sorts of techniques now to probe the unconscious, right? Rather than going to the psychoanalyst and paying, $200 an hour doing that, you can do it here in a very rigorous way, and you can do it inside a magnetic scanner. So people have done this with sex, which is always fun to talk about. So here the way they do it, this is a study out of Minnesota using this technique. So here they have a naked person, either a woman or a man. So they have a pornographic image. Here it's the same image but cut up. Okay, and then you hide it using this continuous flash suppression. So now, first of all, you ask people, what do they see? Well, what they tell you, what they see, if it's done correctly, they just see these flashing lights. Psychologists are suspicious lot, so they don't quite trust. So they say, okay, tell me, is the image on the left side or the right side? And people are chance, 50%. Right? So they don't see it, and that's your experiment. If you look at it, you just don't see the naked person. Now what they do, they test, and this guy, Sheng He, who did the experiment, tested people. He wanted to know, well, if I give you a difficult task afterwards, so I flash up this little grating very briefly, and it's either tilted to the right or tilted either this way or this way. And so you have to give me an objective answer. This is an objective task. You know, is it tilted right or to the left? And you know, tilt is very small. And it's either at the same side of the invisible nude or on the opposite side of the invisible nude. Right? And you now ask the question, well, does it make a difference if it's on the same or the other side? Now, if attention and consciousness are very similar linked, if the claim is, well, you can't attend because you can't see it, then it shouldn't make any difference because it's an invisible object that you're not conscious of. Well, I wouldn't be telling you this if that would be the case. So here this is evidence for 10 men. These are all heterosexual men, and these are 10 straight women. And we can look at the individuals here, we can look at the summary. So what this tells us, in terms of D prime for the expert, this tells us that the men who are looking at man are actually worse off at looking at invisible. So they're worse off in doing this task when this grating is on the side of the invisible naked man, and they're much better off at the side of the invisible naked woman. So this makes sense, right? I mean, at least in terms of in terms of biology, right? I have a picture of a potential mate there, or potential, naked man, and so it's important for me in my survival to know, is it a man or woman, right? And so these are straight men, and so for straight men, they seem to be repelled by images of naked women and attracted by images of, it's always invisible, right? That's the thing. This is not under your control because it's done unconscious, subliminal, under the limelight, as it were, right? Women is different. They don't have to. They don't have this aversion, at least behaviorally, to looking at invisible images of naked women, but they're also attracted by images of a naked. So they can preferentially do the task when there's an invisible naked man behind the image that they don't see. They also did this in homosexual men, and the homosexual men are like straight women. So there are lots of experiments like this that probe the unconscious. So we know attention and consciousness have different neural correlates. I was going to show an fMRI experiment that makes the same point, that primary visual cortex responds to changes in attention, but doesn't respond to changes in awareness. Whether or not you're conscious of the stimulus in this particular experiment by Logotitis and Tanaka doesn't make any difference. Yet the hemodynamic response in V1 is modulated by whether or not the person attends to stimulus. So as I mentioned already, so people are exploring the neural basis of unconscious. There are many, many unconscious behaviors you're capable of, reflexes. You constantly adjust when you're running, for example, train running, or when you're shopping on a very busy street. You constantly have to avoid running into people. You do that all the time. You do it unconsciously. You can show that in lots of experiments. Any overtrained routine, shaving, dressing, tennis, keyboard typing is beautiful experimental evidence, and keyboard typing that you can do it totally being oblivious to it. And of course, people can do blind typing because this is something we all do for many, many hours. Driving, rock climbing, dancing, all those things that are overtrained. In fact, evidence shows when you attend to something, when it's really routine, like they've done this in soccer and in sports, typically your performance becomes worse. Because once you sequence together all the elements of a routine and execute it smoothly, like a serve or like a climbing move or like a dancing move, attending to one out of those sequences will interfere with smooth, effortless performance. What the trainer says, you just do it. You just go out and do it. You empty your mind and do it, and you trust your training, and it works out fine. This beautiful experiment, so-called choice blindness, that you make a choice. In this case, they asked men and women which two of women were more beautiful, and people have no idea why they're making this choice, it turns out, or what they say is totally at odds with what they actually act. So there are many things that we don't have access, and it's interesting, for sort of pop psychology reason, but for a scientist more interesting, it gives rise to the question, what's the neural basis of the difference between, of course, you can make a conscious decision when you truly deliberate, and where's the difference between that and when you make an unconscious decision, and are there different brain areas active, etc. So these are called zombie systems. This is a very rare creature. It's a zombie smurf. And you can ask the question, where's the difference at the level of the brain between these zombie behaviors and conscious behaviors? Finally, I'm not going to make any math here. I just wanted to leave you with a deeper question. Finally, what we need a theory of consciousness. You see, in the fullness of time, and hopefully in the next 10 years here at Mindscope, here at the Institute, we'll be able to identify and say, well, see, whenever the animal, the mouse or the human or the monkey or whoever has this type of activity in that part of the brain, the subject will be conscious of whatever, blue or yellow or camembert cheese for the mice. But that, of course, doesn't, okay, that's nice, because now you can study what happens with, you can track it, you have a biomarker, you can track it in disease and development, etc. But now you want to answer, well, why this activity? Why not that activity? Why in this brain area? Why not in that brain area? So finally, you need a fundamental theory. You need a theory that tells you, is consciousness something that comes along for free as you get more and more complex systems? So you get a little bit in a bee, and you get more in a squid, and you get even more in a mouse, and a human in a dog, and then it sort of peaks supposedly in us? Or is it more fundamental than that? Is it maybe a fundamental property of matter? Is it, for instance, possible, just like in the 16th century, people discovered this new thing called magnetic field, or at the beginning of the 20th century, in the 10s, they discovered, well, actually particles have this new property that we never knew idea of. It's called spin. And it's spin up or spin down. It can be fractional, it can be full. And so suddenly a new property, we realized in order to fully describe the world of elementary particles, we needed this new property. Well, maybe, is it true that, for example, that to fully understand consciousness, we also need to sort of think about something, something fundamentally new? And to what extent, this is a question, particularly if you're a nerd, like me, if you care about other things besides just living things, because does consciousness depend on our substrate? Does it really depend on a brain? On principle, in the favorite thought experiments of philosophy, if I replace each one of my brain cells with a little transistor, so that after a while my entire brain isn't really brain cells anymore, but it's now silicon, well, would I still be conscious? Most people who think about it say yes. Well, that raises the question, can an artificial simulacra of the human brain be conscious? Can the internet be conscious? Can the iPhone be conscious? And so these are all questions that in the fullness of time we need to address. Giulio Tononi, who's one of our advisors, has, I think, to my mind, one of the most compelling, at least attempts to address this in a very fundamental way. I won't talk about it. At least it's a very promising candidate. So, because finally we want a theory that tells us, is this guy C. elegans conscious with his wiring diagram? To what extent is this conscious? What about the mouse? And what about the human brain? And then we want to extend it. What about the Romba? This is a little robot. What about the iPhone 12, not yet released, soon to be lost in a bar close to you? And what about the most complex system built hitherto? This is the most complex machine ever built by mankind. It's the internet. Has on the order of 10 billion nodes. Each node by itself is on the order of a billion or a couple of billion of transistors. So in its entirety, it vastly exceeds the number of synapses in a human brain that we know, of course, conscious. Is this entity conscious, and how would we know? So these are very interesting questions that in the fullness of time we need to answer. So in summary, I hope to convey to you the feeling that the study of the neuronal base of both attention and consciousness has moved from mere philosophical speculation or religious philosophical speculation and deduction into the realm of the empirical, the scientific. We know a functioning brain is sufficient to generate consciousness. It does it day in, day out, and people are trying to isolate which component of the brain is actually necessary. And progress in the science will ultimately enable us to rigorously define, measure, and quantify conscious subjective state across developmental stages, in normal states and in disease, in humans and in other animals. And it would also help us understand our place in this mysterious unfolding universe. And with that, I thank you for your attention and your consciousness. Okay, the question was, can you set up an experiment to test how far, what sort of animals are all, for example, one hypothesis is all multicellular organisms or animals have some form of selective attention. What that means that for the same input, they can respond differently depending on the instruction, or they can neglect one part of the input and selectively focus on the other. In principle, yes. People have done it in Drosophila, so in principle I see no reason why it can't be done In fact, for all I know, it may have been done already in C. elegans. So in principle, yes. No, that's behavior. So selective attention means you ignore certain things at the expense. You preferentially process information here and you neglect the information over here.
Wouldn't that be part of the activity of the organism?
Well, yeah, so for example, if you do, well, for instance, you can have, and people have done these sort of experiments, you do two different sorts of food stuff. They have equal saliency to the animal in terms of how attractive is it. People have done this. And now you can measure what cues, or can you instruct the animal somehow to preferentially go to one versus the other. So in principle, I see no reason that you can't do this. Given the very late hour, maybe we should break off. I should thank you once again for your attention.